Address is Thinking Aloud, BBC Radio 4, Broadcasting House, London W1A 1AA, or you can email us at thinkingaloud@bbc.co.uk. And of course, if you want to hear the programme again, select a past programme from our well-organised archive, sign up for my newsletter, this week full marks for trying, or download our podcast. I listen while I'm uncreasing my beloved husband's shirts, writes Mrs. PW ironically. All you have to do is go to this website and click through bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. But now, to our second dose of unorthodox or unconventional economic analysis. For as long as I can remember, the word development almost been a collective noun, a synonym for the policies which are needed to improve the lot of poorer countries. It seems to make such sense. What else could underdeveloped countries want so much as a helping hand in their development? But as I now learn from a new paper, matters are not perhaps quite as they seem. The paper has the provocative title, Hamlet Without the Prince of Denmark, How Development Has Disappeared from Today's Development Discourse. And its author is Ha-Joon Chang, who's reader in the Political Economy of Development at the University of Cambridge. Ha-Joon, let's just start with the traditional meaning of development. Perhaps we can put the Prince of Denmark back in there again. What's the traditional sense?
Yeah, of course, when people talk about development, the first thing they think about is a high income level. But of course, no one stops there. A lot of people would want to include things like social indicators like health and education. But on top of that, most importantly, until the 1970s, there was a consensus across the political spectrum that development involves a transformation of your productive structure based on accumulation of new technological and organizational capabilities. So this is why people are averse to call a country like Kuwait a developed country, despite the fact that its per capita income is almost as high as that of Italy. This is why when Germany, right after the Second World War, was economically destroyed and its income level fell to that of Peru and Mexico, no one said we should reclassify Germany as a developing country, because everyone knew that the Germans still had the technological and organizational productive capabilities to rebuild the economy, which they did in 10 years.
So your position is that the assumed path towards the development of poorer countries has in a way fundamentally changed since the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, traditionally, it was true, was it, that you helped society to develop by a quite conscious policy of helping them to industrialise, lay down the infrastructure which promoted industrialisation?
Yes, today, however, the dominant view is that development is mainly about poverty reduction. There's very little discussion of how this may be achieved other than through foreign aid and reduction in foreign debt. There's virtually no discussion about how the developing countries should get out of the activities that they are mainly engaged in today, like agriculture and textile. If anything, the rich countries and organizations like the IMF and the World Bank that those countries control encourage the developing countries to do more of the same thing.
And is it also true to say that, I'm looking at the old model of development, when you've got the old model of development, the idea that really you've got to develop the productive processes in these countries, that you would allow that various sorts of tariffs and subsidies would be appropriate in order to enable that industrialization to take off?
Absolutely. I mean, that was taken for granted. Of course, I mean, some countries overdid it and therefore got rightly criticized for it. But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a consensus that the developing countries need to develop so-called their infant industries, new industries that need a period of protection and nurturing before they can stand on their own feet and compete with superior producers from
Probably
abroad.
true of your own country, but
South Korea was a classic example. I mean, let me give you the interesting story. Back in 1965, when South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, the South Korean government applied for a loan to the World Bank to build a new steel mill. And the World Bank said, no, actually, that your country doesn't have any business in this kind of industry. We are not going to give you the loan. The Koreans persisted, and they got a loan from Japan and built this steel mill, which today is the third largest steel producer in the world. So there's a beautiful example of how the free market, the argument that countries should basically stick to what they're already good at is baseless.
The sort of villain of the piece around the table today is probably neoliberalism, because that little phrase has got to come in here, isn't it, as
That's
well?
right,
because you see the association between neoliberalism and a shift in the meaning of development.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's basically what is behind it. I mean, this rise of neoliberalism that Professor Harvey so eloquently explained, basically that is based on this notion that whatever we have is best of all possible worlds, and countries, quote unquote, artificially trying to develop their industries through things like tariffs and subsidies and regulations on foreign investment should be banned from it. And that's why we are seeing so many conditions attached to the loans from the IMF and foreign aid from the United States, the UK, and other rich countries, saying that these countries should, the developing countries should liberalize their trade, liberalize their foreign investment, and privatize
Of course,
their
the slogan "free trade" does seem to have. I mean, it rings some bells. It has some appeal. I mean, isn't it in any way beneficial to poor countries to provide them with access to richer markets?
Oh yeah, in the short run, probably the poor countries are in most cases better off having free trade, because it means that they can import cheaper things from abroad. But in the long run, I don't know of any country that has become rich on the basis of growing coffee, on the basis of digging out iron ore. So you have to industrialize.
Now, this, when you're talking about this, of course, about this new view of development, I mean, this isn't just the view of a few economists, this is the view of major organizations. I think that the UN Millennium Development Goals, which came out in 2000, they embody this attitude towards this new version of development.
That's right. I mean, there are 8 goals, and 7 of them are about poverty reduction and improving health and education. I mean, there's nothing wrong with those things, but there's a very little discussion on how the developing countries might actually transform their economies into a more productive one. And what little there is basically saying that you have to stick to what you are already good at. So the developed countries should try to help the developing countries by importing more agricultural products or textiles. There's no notion that the developing countries need to develop new industries and new activities.
But I wonder if you're being a bit harsh. I mean, some of the things which are mentioned in the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, I mean, human rights, primary education, gender equality, all of these, it would seem that perhaps that these would have some economic development on poor countries.
Yes, I mean, indirectly, yes. But my problem is that these are all very individualistic notions. I mean, you educate people better, make them healthier, give them a bit of micro loan, and then they somehow will exercise their natural tendency to truck and barter and somehow create a prosperous economy. But when you actually look at the history of capitalism, development has never been achieved on the basis of this small one man and his dog kind of enterprise. I mean, if there's anything that really distinguishes the United States and Germany on the one hand from, say, the Philippines and Nigeria on the other hand, is not their medical doctors and economists, which those the poorer countries have in abundance, but things like Boeing and Volkswagen.
So, I mean, you might be able to promote thousands of small businesses and thousands and hundreds of thousands of small entrepreneurs, but you'd want to say this doesn't provide the actual lift-off which enables this.
Exactly. Unless you transform the social structure, unless you transform institutions and the productive organizations, what are they going to do? They are all going to sell noodles on the street. They are all going to shine shoes, but there's only so much that they can do.
Have there been any countries which have gone alone? I mean, what happens if a country decides to go alone and says, well, listen, we're going to go and we're going to build an industrial infrastructure, we're going to go in that route?
Well, actually, virtually all of today's rich countries, starting from 18th century Britain down to 19th century US, Germany, and 20th century Japan and Korea, have actually achieved their prosperity down the road. I mean, they were not on the basis of free trade and free market. Okay,
we'll leave it there. I just wondered, coming back to you, David Harvey, listening to that, I don't know whether you'd had an opportunity to read the paper before, but listening to what Ha-Joon was saying there, what is your reaction?
I love this image of Hamlet without the prince, but I think it's also Hamlet without the ghost. And the ghost in the room for me is that this idea that you can reduce poverty without interfering in the accumulation of wealth. I think we should convert all anti-poverty programs into anti-wealth programs.
Okay, what is your response to that, Haju?
Well, that probably is because of my own background, growing up in South Korea in the 60s and 70s when the income was growing at 7, 8, 9% per year. I think that on the whole, I mean, I'm not against stopping growth in the rich countries, given the level of income they have achieved. But I think that most developing countries still need rapid economic growth to reduce poverty and inequality.
You said, by the way, didn't you, just before, I was impressed with that countries which had attempted to go down a different route, I mean, are there examples of where they have been punished in contemporary circles for going down a different route?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the rich countries have plenty of means of punishment. I mean, they can stop giving loans through the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, they can take the offending countries to the dispute settlement court in the WTO. They can put a lot of pressure through their foreign aid policies. So
there we must stop. Hajun Chang
Thank you.
and David Harvey, thank you very, very much indeed.